I'd like to welcome Ahunna Eziakonwa. She's the Assistant Secretary General and Director for the Bureau for Africa at the United Nations Development Program, UNDP. Quite a title, Ahunna. Thank you so much for being here. So, we were just talking briefly about the role of UNDP and how it distinguishes itself separate from the other UN agencies. Maybe you can just walk the room slightly through that and sort of how that then plays into what you're doing on the African continent.
Right, so thanks, Jennifer. It's great to be here. So UNDP is, that UN agency that is the premier development agency. So the D is very important there. And it is one of the UN entities that isn't focused on a particular sector, so we're not, say, education or health or a food agency, but we are more, I think the DNA of UNDP is more like an integrator. So you look at human development as a whole and sustainable development, and you try to see the whole value chain of development. What are the different pieces of the puzzle, and how do you put them all together? So that's really what defines UNDP. It is the integrator, connects the dots.
And talk about how that then translates on the ground, because you are working with different offices across the African continent, and really, as the panel is called, putting a lot of this development discussion to work. I mean, can you just walk us through that briefly?
Yeah, so that's another thing that I think is quite unique about the UNDP's business model. We are on the ground, so it is field-based. UNDP is in 170 countries in the world, and in Africa, we're in every country on the continent. And this is important because obviously you need the development intelligence. You need to be able to understand, our offices are more like listening posts. Yeah. Because what UNDP does is not to basically impose development solutions on countries, but to accompany countries in their development journey by bringing our whole vast global network of ideas and solutions to bear on how countries are preparing their programs. But we do that also by listening intently to what countries want to do, what their cultural context dictate, but also socially what the people want for themselves. And so UNDP is sort of accompanying, it is also drawing out. We have these accelerator labs, which UNDP invested in with some partners, including Qatar, a few years ago. And the accelerator labs actually recognize the fact that you have this possibility of homegrown solutions being fed into the development journey. And so rather than coming as externals, to say what we think development is about, we have these labs that go into societies and work with government to say, where are the best solutions that are coming out of here? How do we promote those? How do we lift them up into what we understand to be plans that countries should have for their development? So it's a development service orientation rather than a development fund, so to speak. Yeah.
How do you, considering 54 countries, there's a myriad of issues, right, that each country is facing. Regionally, we can get into that later, but how do you focus in on the issues that are most pressing? What is it that UNDP is really prioritizing right now?
Well, okay, so our priorities are the country's priorities, right? So we don't have UNDP priorities per se. That's sort of informed by what the needs are on the ground. And that's why I think it's important to have the presence, because then we're able to, to really understand, to get the insights as to what those countries need. The problem that we've had in development assistance on the continent is this whole mindset that's been there for many years, that when you think Africa, you think a place, a country, right? And yet you're talking about 54 diverse contexts. What Chad needs is very different from what a country like South Africa needs, right? So we're looking at customization. So when you get to a country, you understand where they're at in their journey and what the people are demanding. But there are some commonalities, though. So just getting to your question now, jobs. That's a huge priority because you're talking about a very young population on the continent. Sometimes 60, 70% are under the age of 30. Yeah. This is the productive demographic that you have there, and the danger of not making not ensuring that growth is job rich is that obviously you're unleashing a lot of young idle people who then become vulnerable to bad guys who are trying to use energetic bright young people for bad things. So really important to ensure that we close the jobs gap. That's a big priority for us, for governments. The second one is, I think, we need to fight inequality, because you find that some of the sort of more well-endowed countries in terms of economic growth are also the ones with the widest inequality gaps. So it's possible to have economic growth without spreading the goods. So UNDP is really interested in coming up with systems, governance. We work a lot in governance structures, institutions that can deploy more integrity and equality and fairness in the way resources are shared. And this particularly, I think, the emphasis that we have on gender, because in Africa, women are hugely marginalized. Young people are marginalized, but so are women. And I think there is no future without women. And it's really important to ensure that all development programming and designs have the lens of gender and gender equality right at the heart. Not only in terms of livelihoods and what we do at operations level, but making sure that women are occupying decision-making positions.
Right.
Yeah, because sometimes countries go off track because those who are making the decisions are not doing it right. And we need to bring more women into the room because they are in the trenches. They understand what the issues are, and they can actually offer insights that make a difference.
Well, and you've talked a lot about the importance of partners, right, as well. I mean, obviously, there are domestic partners, but when we think the international community, that is important. And I wanted to read a quote that Ahunna said not too long ago. You said, partners need to flip the script from misery to promise when looking at Africa. When you're talking about this lens of development, has the script been flipped, so to speak? I mean, what you're talking about, or do you think there is still ways to go?
It is evolving, I would say, much more than a decade ago. We're seeing our development partners talking increasingly about financing as opposed to sort of aid. We see key development partners actually opening up opportunities for investments, using their platforms to market Africa as an investment destination and as a viable one. I think that's a big shift. It's an important recognition that aid alone isn't going to solve Africa's problems. Right. And that we need to infuse this idea that the continent has opportunities for leveraging resources that are at scale to do bigger things. Because I think part of the problem has been this idea of doing small projects. Even UNDP is also, we're waking up and moving from projects to portfolio, where we're looking at systems shifts rather than, the small pockets of things that we do that don't really add up. I mean, we've been at this for 50 years, and we can't say that we have ended poverty in enough places in the world. So walking away from managing poverty to promoting wealth creation and shared prosperity is the shift. It's coming, but it's way too slow. And that's really our mission, is to make sure that all partners working in Africa get this message. Because I think that's what's going to create opportunities for transformation, as opposed to just a development practice that is heavy on transaction.
On transactions.
Rather than transformation.
Yeah, but I mean, still, you're making it a priority, though, to focus in on investment and investment opportunities, in particular with the Sustainable Finance Hub that UNDP is focused on.
Correct.
Because that still plays into what you were talking about, the jobs and the wealth creation. Can you talk about how maybe that is helping push the needle forward in terms of what it is you're doing?
Indeed. So a few years ago, the UNDP administrator established this sustainable finance hub. I mean, you could say UNDP is not a finance institution, so we're not the World Bank or even the Capital Development Fund. But if we're going to achieve the sustainable development goals, we need to solve the development finance problem. And you can't, as I said, you can't just do it from an aid perspective. So where's the money? Right, that's going to help solve all these gaps that we have in infrastructure, in energy, in health, and health systems, in food systems. Where's that money going to come from? It's trillions of dollars, not billions, that's required. And so private sector, it's a big part of that. And our Sustainable Finance Hub, and we did establish a branch of it for Africa, for the region, in Pretoria, looking at how we improve our work with private sector, how we help governments to bring private sector closer and to create the enabling environment for them to play. If you think energy, there is no government that's going to be able to deal with the energy poverty that we have on the continent without private sector. It's the private sector investors that will bring the kind of money that's needed to shift that needle. So how do they work with private sector? So we are doing all that kind of work. But then also on the private sector side, helping them understand where the opportunities are. So we have what we call the SDG investor maps. We've done this in about 36 countries, helping governments work with us to showcase where to invest and making that available to investors. But more importantly, and in our interest, is aligning that to the SDGs and saying, here are the sectors where when you invest in these sectors, you're going to have the greatest impact on human development and on sustainability, so that investors also are sharing the values that make for a sustainable future. So the investor maps are important, and we're doing that. With the investor maps, we're also helping with development finance assessments. You'll be surprised, a lot of countries actually are not fully aware of the assets they have in terms of the finance potential of their own domestic assets. So getting an assessment of that so that they have it front and center as they do their negotiations with their partners. You need to know what you have and how to value your assets to be able to make a stronger case for investors to come in. So development assessment, finance assessments, the integrated financing frameworks, again, very much directed at domestic resource mobilization. And then, of course, tax revenues and how you also align that to the SDGs. So these are all the different aspects that the Finance Sector Hub deals with.
Would you say that the continent, the region, is on track to getting closer to achieving these SDGs? I mean, there are, as we mentioned, a number of issues still. Are the right steps being taken, though, to get us closer to that goal that the UN has?
Yeah, I would say in terms of planning, yes. For instance, if you look at the SDGs that relate to climate change and environment overall, practically all African countries have now ambitious nationally determined contributions, NDCs, as part of their planning, and UNDP has supported them in developing these. So in these NDCs, they state clearly how they are going to contribute to net zero and how they can actually develop greener pathways in their development trajectory, right? So the plan is there, but the financing is not there. For execution, right? So when you say, are we close? I would say, no, we're off track. And we're actually largely out of step with what is needed when it comes to execution. Plans, all there. If you look at all national development plans, they're all gender sensitive, climate sensitive, inclusion minded, all the right things. But the financing, it's really way out of the expectation or the need.
And I don't really have any more time, but I wanted to ask you one really quick question. I mean, for the investment community who maybe is still, risk averse to wanting to invest in the region, I mean, what would your message be then, if the financing is what is needed?
Really listen and get to know Africa. I mean, the perception of high risk is really out of place, and I think this is what's making a lot of investors hesitate. So I think it's important to visit the continent, and when I say visit, don't just go to one or two countries that look good. It really is important to discover Africa from Cape to Cairo and familiarize yourself with what the potential. Other investors are doing that from other parts, from other regions. And then I think really invest in startups. We didn't talk about Timbuktu today, but there are a lot of young people with great ideas. And these ideas will solve development problems and challenges and world challenges. And I think investors can look at what's happening in this sort of innovation space with young people. They might be quite excited and inspired.